Okay, thank you to everybody for joining. Tonight, we are continuing our shiur on Tachanun, the Nefilat Apayim, or the supplications that are recited after the Amidah, after the repetition of the Chazar of the Shliach Tzibor, after Shemona Esrei. There is a section known as Tachanun, sometimes known as Nefilat Apayim. And last week we looked at the early history, the ancient history of Nefilat Apayim. And we saw many sources in Chazal from the Tanaim and the Amoraim where there was a practice to offer personal supplications, and it would seem extemporaneous um, supplications after Shemona Esrei. We noted that that these supplications did not seem obligatory, and nor did we see any fixed ruling from the Gemara that says that you have to do such a thing after Shemona Esrei. There's no strict instruction of such a thing. We just see evidence of it happening. We see Amoraim composing personal prayers after the Amidah. We find Tanaim having this minhag of Nefilat Apayim, and all sorts of tidbits here and there throughout Chazal. We never find a concrete halacha in Chazal that tells us that we need to do Nefilat Apayim or we need to do Tachanun. Therefore, there's a lot of evidence for such a practice, but it's kind of nebulous. It's kind of murky as exactly what it is they did in that time. And we hypothesized that perhaps Tachanun was a counterbalance to the fixity and the standardization of the Amidah, meaning that the Amidah was such a fixed prayer that it didn't offer room for people to give their own personal prayers. And for the worshiper who preferred to pray in their own words, in their own language, the time of Tachanun provided such an outlet. And in that vein, it would seem that from the time of the Amoraim onwards, the language of Tachanun was exceptionally fluid. It was incredibly personal. And we wouldn't have had, there wouldn't have been any nusach that we could have pinned down and said, oh, that is Nefilat Apayim. That is what you should say or could say for Tachanun. We just don't have anything like that. It's very murky from the time of Chazal. It isn't until the Middle Ages that we find anything, or the end of the Dark Ages, really, that we find anything that gives us a clue to how people would practice this. It's really until it's really till the end of the Dark Ages that's where we are illumined, so to speak. We have an illumination of sources for what things looked like. And tonight I want to discuss the medieval history of Tachanun. Even though we're missing a few hundred years of history, and we don't know what Tachanun looked like at the later stages of the Amoraim. We don't know what it looked like in the Dark Ages. It's the medieval history of Tachanun which is going to concern us tonight, and the modern history we will save, God willing, for next week. So when I say we're going to discuss the medieval history, what I want to learn tonight is, what did it look like to say Tachanun in medieval times? And I want to discuss particularly the things that usually get overlooked, not just what they said or when they would say it, right? Not just those obvious things, like, well, how did it look like when they said Tachanun? What words did they say? When would they skip Tachanun? What did it look like in shul? That's pretty obvious. And I think the last time we gave a shiur on Tachanun, we covered it in 7 shiurim because we really went into the text. This time I want to divide it into periods, and I think that might give us its own lens into how the Tachanun developed. And there's honestly a lot that gets overlooked. There, just as a teaser, we know that some Jews would prostrate themselves and bow just like the Muslims did. There's a legend that the Monday and Thursday Tachanun was written by captives on a boat who ended up in a perilous situation in a foreign land. And there is rumors that people were saying Nefilat Apayim by Arvit. So let's look at um, these often overlooked aspects of Tachanun in medieval times, so that we can get a somewhat clear picture of what Tachanun must have looked like in the High Middle Ages until modern times. So now, um, the the language in the time of the Amoraim was clearly fluid. The problem is that between you and me, if you just think about that problem, if you think about the fluidity of such text, most people are not, between you and me, most people are today, and probably for a long time, are not skilled enough to pray in their own words or to compose a prayer of their own. Maybe it's a cultural thing, maybe it's a Yeridat Dorot, but most people would be at a loss to choose or to compose their own tefillot for Tachanun. Whether you had to choose your own Pirkei Tilim, whether you had to say your own words, it's almost like when you're in second grade and the teacher gives out an assignment and he says, write a story about anything. And everyone's like, but what are we supposed to write a story about? What are we supposed to write an essay about? Anything. You ever had a teacher who did that to you? It's terrible. Some people really cannot hack the extemporaneous format. They just don't have the skills. In this case, by Tachanun, standardization probably has more benefits than cons, even though it's completely contradictory. The whole point, as it seems from the earliest sources in Chazal, the whole point of Tachnun was to allow people to be fluid, to allow people to be flexible, and to offer their supplications to Hashem in their own words. And yet, in a contradictory fashion, standardization seems to work better because it's something that people could actually use. And many people felt helpless without having words to having their own words, having set words, I should say, to pray the Tachnun with. Now, in the time of the Amoraim, we saw, like in the Gemara and Brachot, that we have almost, I think, 13 in total, 13 different prayers that the Amoraim used to say. Now, if these were completely personal, right? If the Gemara was talking about private tefillot, we wouldn't know what Rav said. We wouldn't know what Rav Yehuda Hanasi said. We wouldn't know the prayers that these sages had said because they were private. Clearly, they must have said these prayers publicly, right? Because in their time, they never wrote anything down. So if the Amoraim were not writing their prayers down, since that was against the halacha, it must be that these were tefillot that they said when they were shaliach tzibor. So if somebody like Rav Chia or Rav or Yehuda Hanasi was the shaliach tzibor, after Shemon Esrei, they would recite their own personal prayer aloud, and there were formats and formulas that they used, which became famous. Now, that's interesting for late antiquity. That tells us that in the 300s or 400s, it's very likely that it was up to the shliach tzibor to be, that it was up to the shliach tzibor to compose something like Nefilat Apayim for the Kahal. I'm sorry, I think I shared the wrong slide with my slides. But yeah, in the time of the Maraim, we could suspect that the formula was up to the Shliach Tzibor. Now, what happens when we move on into the Dark Ages? What do we find? So let me share my screen. I'm sorry. Here we go. Come. That Svi just arrived. Okay. So let me show you here a siddur from the 1300s. This is a siddur from this in the Bodleian collection in Oxford. It says here, this is a Spanish siddur, "V'noflin al peneihem v'omrim rahum v'hanun chatanu lefanecha rachem aleinu," and then it begins David elecha Hashem nafshi esa. And it continues all the way until the end of the parak, and it says, Avinu malkeinu avinu ata, Avinu malkeinu ein lanu melech ela ata. We could see from this siddur that by the 1300s, right? So again, I ended with the late antiquity, but from the when you get to the 1300s, the Sfaradim themselves are finding a fixed format for Tachanun. If you open up a Machzor Vitri, which is much more easily accessible, so I don't have it as a picture here on the screen, but if you open a Machzor Vitri already in the 11th century, so in the 1000s, we find standardization and a fixed formula. The Ashkenazim began to fix the formula. They began to fix this and standardize the text of Tachanun far earlier than the Spanish did. That much we know. Yet we move to the time of the Geonim, right? The High Middle Ages and the end of the Dark Ages. What we find is complete fluidity. While we find in some of the Sidurim of the Geonim, we find some languages for Tachanun, we simply do not see any mandated we don't see a mandated text like we have here. We just don't have it. The Rambam Gaon has a suggested prayer. Rav Sadia Gaon has a suggested prayer. The only, I would say, common denominator among all these prayers is that all of them contain V'anachnu lo neda ma na'aseh. V'anachnu lo neda ma na'aseh is the earliest part of the tefillah that we find in all of the nuschaot of the Geonim. So if you look at the nature of that tefillah, and again, I don't want to discuss the text specifically tonight. It's most similar to what you could call in English a cento. It's kind of a collection of different verses that are put together to create one congruent long sentence. If you take a bunch of sentences from around Tanakh and you put them into one long series that makes sense. Right? You continue on and on in a kind of progression of sentences that make sense together. The most typical of all of these tefillot, frankly, if you want to know about the Nusach HaBavli, and you want to know how the Nusach looked like in the time of the Geonim, the most typical one is that from Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon is very typical of a Nusach from Bavel, and this is how they would do it in the yeshivot of Bavel. Again, I won't go through the whole Nusach tonight because I think it's going a bit too far. But here, if you look at the Nusach, he says, Rahum v'chanun chatanu l'fanecha rachim aleinu nosei avon ve'over al pesha chatanu l'fanecha rachim aleinu. And then I believe somewhere here at the end, v'anachnu lo nedam ma na'aseh. Among all the nuschaot in the time of the Geonim, there's roughly 3 sections. Some of them have 4. There's also a Nusach Eretz Yisrael, and it's over time we find more embellishments. But the only thing that kind of ties together all the nuschaot in that era between, let's say, the 800s and the 1100s is that they usually broke it up into about 3 sections. One of them would begin Rachum v'chanun chatanu l'fanecha. Then they would say whatever they wanted in the middle, and then they would end it with something like V'anachnu lo neda ma na'aseh. The only study which has been done of the Geniza material was done by Ruth Langer. And one of the things she notes is the irony that the Geonim instruct us. They say the halacha is that after the Kahal does a Tachanun, and they do whatever they want. The Geonim say you could say whatever you want. They give a suggestion, but they say you could do whatever you want. After that section, they say that the Shliach Tzibur is supposed to get up and say, V'anachnu lo neda ma na'aseh. And that's a little bit ironic, because what he is saying is that we, the Kahal, do not know how to approach Hashem. We, the Kahal, do not know how to beseech Hashem. He's kind of acting in lieu of the Kahal when they themselves are not on the level to write their own or to say their own Nefilat Apayim. He's coming as an agent of them, and he's standing up and he's saying, V'anachnu lo neda ma na'aseh. So it's a very interesting feature. It could be that paragraph is universal to the early nuschaot of Tachanun simply because it's the Shliach Tzibur acting as the agent for anybody who didn't know how to do Nefilat Apayim on their own and make up their own thing. Clearly, in their time, as we see from multiple sources in the Geonim, in their time, it was popular for people to say whatever they wanted, however they wanted, despite the recommendations of the Geonim. Even though they recommended what to say, and they had their own formulas, some people would say Tilim, some people would say what the Geonim said to put in, some people would say all sorts of piyutim, but nobody seems to have fixed onto one until the 11th century in the Ashkenazi lands, or until the 1300s or the late 1200s in Sfaradi lands. Okay, that's so much for the history of the Nusach. Now, we see, in other words, to summarize, In the time of the Amoraim, it seems to be that the Shliach Tzibur is in charge at the end of late antiquity. Then it goes dark for a few hundred years. Then in the Geonim's time, we see that they start recommending certain texts, but people are still fluid about it. And the Shliach Tzibur is tasked with saying V'anachnu lo neda. And then in the 11th century, the Ashkenazim begin to standardize the text. And in the 1300s, the Sfaradim begin to standardize the text. But before that, it's still very fluid. Now, if we look into the Teshuvot of the Geonim, the Teshuvot of the Geonim give us the next collection of information that we have about Tachanun in the Middle Ages. And there's 3 sets of Teshuvot that I want to discuss tonight, which all have their own layer of interesting development. The first set of Teshuvot discusses the obligation. The Geonim make it clear, especially Rav Natronai Gaon. He says, Tachanun is a reshut, period. It's not a chiyuv. You do not have to say it. And therefore, because it is not a chiyuv, anytime someone wants to say it or doesn't want to say it, it's just minhag. Don't fuss about it. That's their core message. So there were customs that varied within the yeshivot of Bavel themselves about when people would or would not say Tachanun. For example, on Purim, in the yeshiva of Amram Gaon, they would say Tachanun, but 150, 200 years later, in the yeshiva of Hai Gaon, they would not say Tachanun. On Tishrei and Nisan, the Geonim also bring that those are days of Simcha, and because Tachanun represents Tsa'ar, they didn't say Tachanun in those months. Furthermore, they say Shabbat, Yom Tov, Erev Shabbat, Erev Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, all sorts of times were not appropriate for Tachanun, simply because, well, it's a minhag, you don't have to do it, and if it's a day of Simcha, ignore it. Clearly, Rav Amram Gaon believed that Tachanun was important enough that we should say it even on Purim, but regardless, it was clearly up to minhag, and nobody fussed about it. It wasn't an area of contention whatsoever. The second set of teshuvot deals with how one should bow, and oops, you know what? I have the wrong slide open. But let me go back to show you what Rav Sadia Gaon says, just to give you an idea of the variation here. Rav Sadia Gaon says in his Siddur, he says, "Maniach et birko asmolit ala haaretz." You put your left knee on the ground, kidarko yoshev, like you were sitting. Umekapel et birko hamanit, and you fold your right knee as if you're kneeling. Kidarko kshu korea, v'chatzi korea v'chatzi yoshev. A person should kneel on one knee, in other words, and then he should say Tachanun. Rav Sadia Gaon holds that when a person says Tachanun, he should be kneeling, while the other Geonim have a completely different way of doing this. They say that a person should lean on his left side, meaning you're already sitting on the ground, crouch forward and lean on your left side so that your face is facing the right. They give all sorts of reasons for this. There's Pesukim. There's, the idea that the Malach Hara is on the left side. You should face away from it. And there's this idea that from the Gemara says that you shouldn't bow on a stone floor, right? A person's not supposed to bow on a stone floor because of a chashash avodah zarah. So just in case a person's in front of a stone floor, he should, when he crouches for Nefilat Apayim, he's falling on his face, but he turns a little bit left. Furthermore, there was another regulation that only an Adam Chashuv was allowed. We saw this in the Gemara last time we learned. Only an Adam Chashuv, a person who was very worthy or thought that he was as Chashuv as Yeshua ben Nun, that if he bowed down straight with his head down on the ground, that he would be answered by Hashem, should bow down, but everybody else should not bow down straight. So in order to prevent themselves from looking haughty, that they were as Chashuv as Yeshua ben Nun, they would bend their necks. Essentially, the Geonim are telling you, when you fall, if you're sitting on the floor, most people in the Beit HaKnesset sat on the floor in those times. When you're falling on your face, bend your head a little. It is in the time of the Geonim that everybody says to bend on the left. By the time of the Rishonim, there is different opinions in the Rishonim where they say you should move to your right, and everybody has his own Kabbalistic reason and his own pasuk for how to justify that practice. But for the sake of time, we're gonna skim over that for the moment. There was another practice which was to crane one's head up towards the sky. In other words, in order to show that you're not bowing to the floor, they would bow down, but then they would crane their neck up towards the sky, which we're going to discuss again in a second. The last set of teshuvot discusses um Arvit. And look at the Siddur of Sadia in front of you. It says Ve'en hechrech b'nefilat apayim acharei tefilat halayla. After the evening prayers, you are not required to say Tachanun. Ela sherabim min b'nei amenu. But many people in Klal Yisrael, osim ken kitosefet, they do it. Ve'en rabbi davar, there's nothing wrong with it. Rav Sadia Gaon is telling us that in his time, maybe in Egypt, maybe in Bavel, many people were doing Tachnun by Arvit. It was a very common occurrence. We also see in the other teshuvot of the Geonim, like Marsar Shalom, he also has a teshuvah where he was asked this, and he said, "Yes, you can do Tachnun by Arvit." Later, we find another Gaon who says, "No, people shouldn't be doing Tachnun by Arvit." But the Rambam in his halachot mentions that already by his time, the 12th century, there were still people in Egypt doing Tachnun by Arvit. So it sounds like, for some reason, in Bavel or in Egypt, it was a very popular practice for people to recite Tachanun after Arvit, just like you would do it after Mincha, just like you would do it after Shachrit. And we don't know why. It could be because they thought Arvit was more of a chovah. It could be because they just like doing it. For all we know, the Ashkenazim used to do a pitum haketoret after Arvit, which is a minhag which fell away. But the Rambam attests that Yechidim, individuals in his time, were still doing Tachanun by Arvit. So clearly, from Rav Sadia's time all the way to the Rambam's time, it decreased from many people to just individuals. And clearly, it wasn't a very popular minhag by the time of the Rambam. Speaking of the Rambam, I want to delve into this other interesting part of history, and I want to do the Rambam with you together. We're going to learn the Rambam together because the Rambam gives us a good snapshot of how the history of the halachot developed, how by the time of the early Rishonim, a formula and a set instruction for how to do Nefilat Apayim was growing. Let's start with this. Hashtachavaya ketzad. What is prostration, says the Rambam. He's talking about the different bowings by tefillah. After a person raises up from bowing down for saying Oseh Shalom, Yeshiv La'aretz, a person, when he's done Shemona Esrei, he should sit on the ground, nofel al panav, and he should fall on his face, Aretz on the ground, a person should do Nefilat Apayim and do whatever Tachanunim he wants. Clearly, in the time of the Rambam, people were still very fluid about Tachanun. They would say whatever they wanted. Now the Rambam begins to define things. Kriya is on the knees. Kida is bowing alapayim, means to bow forward so that your face faces the floor. Hishtachavaya, prostration, zep pishut yadayim v'raglayim. That's spreading out onto the floor, hands in the front, feet in the back. Achenu samutal panav arza, till a person's flat on his face. That's the first halacha. The next halacha says the Rambam, kishu osa nefilat apayim, nefilat panim achar tefilah, yesh mishu osa kida, v'yesh mishu osa hishtachavaya. The Rambam is saying that there are people in our time, some people by Tachnun, they bow while sitting. Some people prostrate themselves while on the floor. The asur, and he qualifies it. He says, by the way, it's asur lasot tishtachvei alavanim ala b'mikdash. You cannot prostrate yourself on stone except in the Beit HaMikdash, etc. Vein adam chashuv rashad lipol panav, and adam chashuv is not also allowed to fall on his face because it's not a good idea. Umutar. And then he also says, he says, you don't have to do Shemona Esrei in the same place as you're doing Tachnun. Fine. Let's look at the last halacha. Minhag Pashut B'Kol Yisrael. The minhag is accepted among everyone in Klal Yisrael that there's no Nefilat Apayim when Shabbat, Moadim, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim, Mincha of Erev Shabbat, Yom Tov, and not Arvit B'Chol Yom. But there are still individuals who are doing it by Arvit and Yom Kippurim, by Yom Kippur, Bilvad, Noflim Alpneim B'chol Tefillah. We do Tachnun by every Tefillah, B'nei Yom Techina Bakasha V'Ta'anit. Beautiful. Now, what sounds like from this Rambam is that some people would bow, some people would prostrate, but it sounds like the Rambam himself prefers prostration for Nefilat Apayim, meaning completely bending forward, maybe not spread eagle, but at least the way the Muslims do it. And this is a part of history which is not very well known. But the Rambam's son, Rabbi Avraham ben HaRambam, got into a major controversy I was about to say it the British way, controversy. But he got into a major controversy when he was the Nagid of Egypt, when he was the leader of Egypt. When while Rabbi Avram ben Haramam was the leader, he became leader at like 19. You see, the Rambam was made Nagid of Mitzrayim, but before the Rambam, there was a different family, the family of I think they were called the Bnei Hashishi. They were the sons of a certain prominent rabbi that was the Nagid, the leader before the Rambam. And after the Rambam was niftar, his son Rabbi Avraham was only 19 years old, but he was a great scholar. The community loved the Maimonides family, so they appointed Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam as the Nagid over the entire Fustat. And of course, the other family, the Bnei Hashishi, didn't like that. They did not really approve of having such a young person being the rabbi and the leader over them. Furthermore, they were in charge of the Jews of Fustat, of Cairo, that followed Minhag Eretz Yisrael. And they still had beef with the Rambam. They didn't love everything the Rambam was trying to do. The Rambam really did not like it seems that he did not like the minhagim of the rabbinical school of Eretz Yisrael, meaning the Geonim of Eretz Yisrael, that whole branch of rabbinic Judaism, the Rambam simply didn't like. He tried to abolish reciting the Kriyat Torah over 3 years instead of over 1 year. He seemed to have gotten into some arguments with them because they were really the Rabbanim of the other community in Fustat. There was the Rabbanim, the Bavliim, right? There was the Rabbanim who followed the Geonim of Bavel. And then there was a smaller community of the Rabbanim who followed the Geonim of Eretz Yisrael. And they simply didn't like the Maimonides family as much as everybody else did. Rabbi Avram ben Aramam in particular wrote a sefer called Sefer HaMaspik L'Ovdei Hashem. It's Kitab al-Bidin. I don't remember al-Kfiyin, I think. Something in Arabic. The entire sefer was written originally in Arabic, and therefore it was lost to the Rishonim and to the Achronim for many hundreds of years. It is not well known. The poskim don't really reference this work at all. But in Hebrew, it was recently republished. It's called Sefer HaMaspik L'Ovdei Hashem. It was published by Bar Ilan University. They did a very good translation, and I recommend anybody who needs it look there. And also Feldheim has a translation as well. Now, the Sefer HaMaspik, in the Sefer HaMaspik, Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam goes on a multi-chapter long tirade about the importance of hishtachaviyah, prostration, in tefillah. And step by step, he goes through different motions during prayer, like standing, sitting, bending, bowing, prostrating. But it's hishtachaviyah that he harps on. And essentially, what happened was like this. As I mentioned earlier, when Jews would bow for Nefilat Apayim, they would bow with their heads to the ground, but they would turn their heads. Some Jews would bring their heads up. The Goyim saw this. The Muslims passing by saw the Jews bowing like that. The Karaim, who were passing by, saw them. They used to make fun of them. They would call that Jewish bowing. They thought it was hilarious because it wasn't like, to them, that wasn't a respectful way to bow before Hashem. And he took that insult personally. He thought that they were right. There was not an appropriate way to bow in front of Hashem. So he goes on a very long argument in Sefer HaMaspik, where he argues that hishtachaviyah is found throughout Tanakh. And the Sugyot in Bavli all seem to indicate that Nefilat Apayim means hishtachaviyah. And he argues that we have to restore the way it used to be. And we have to pray just like the Muslims do. And when it comes to bowing by tefillah, a person by Shemona Esrei is allowed to just bow, but really those 4 times that he could bow, he could also prostrate himself. And by Tachanun, a person should definitely prostrate himself. And furthermore, by Kiddusha and Kaddish, those bowing should definitely be a prostration. So by Kiddusha, Kadosh, 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 a person should get on the floor like the Muslims do and bow 3 times, just like the Muslims do. Kadosh, 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 3 times the person should bow. Now, in Muslim theology, they have something called salat. Salat for them is the bowing portion of prayer. That's where, for them, the shvach of Hashem requires this bowing motion. They do the bowing over and over, but it's a shvach. For them, the bowing is the ikar, and the prayers are the tafel, right? Especially bakasha, that's all tafel. Shvach is the best for them. Bakasha is secondary. For us, of course, bakasha is first, and bowing is something which Chazal simply prescribe at certain parts of tefillah, but we definitely don't do the prostration. Avram ben Arambam was arguing, no, Jewish people always did prostration, and we should go back to doing it that way. And it's not bechukot lo telechu, it's not chukot hagoyim. Why? Because they stole it from us, and so we should continue doing it. And he was successful. He had an entire group of pietists, of Hasidim, mystically inclined people, who in Egypt were doing this, and they were bowing, they were prostrating themselves by tefillah. And there were a couple of other liturgical innovations he did. And if anybody wants to see it, look at Parak Chaf Hey and Sefer Chaf Daled Chaf Hey and Sefer Maspik, and look at the Sefer from Naftali Weeder in Volume 2, and Hitkab Chut Nusachat Tefillah b'Mizachu b'Ma'arav. Clear, his opponents, the opponents of Rabbi Avram ben Arambam, were arguing that you're trying to Islamize Jewish prayer. You're just looking at the Goyim and you're saying their way is better. We should do it that way. While he was arguing, no, this is the Jewish way, and we should serve Hashem like proper servants. Okay, what I'm showing here on the screen is a fragment from the Karaganiza. What happened was that after Rabbi Avraham ben Arambam passed away, 20 years later, there was some rabbi in the community who got up and started yelling against this minhag. 20 years later, he's like, okay, I know there are people in the community here in Egypt who are bowing like the Muslims do. You guys got to stop that. It's not a good minhag. And it came to an argument in the Jewish community about whether or not the Jews should be allowed to prostrate themselves the way the Muslims do in prayer. Unfortunately, this got political, and somebody sent a question, as you see here on this page. This is written in Arabic. They sent a lawsuit basically to the judges, the Muslim judges in Cairo, and they asked them, what's your opinion? Oh, dear Muslim judges, what's your opinion? Honorable judges, what should the Jews do? Should they be allowed to pray like the Muslims, or they should not be allowed to pray like the Muslims? And they make it clear in the tshuva that this leader of the Jews has died 20 years ago, and this is why the controversy is beginning now. Clearly, just evidenced by history, these innovations or restorations of Rabbi Avraham ben Arambam did not survive. Clearly, despite his reform, nobody wanted to continue this minhag of bowing like the Muslims did by Nefilat Apayim, but there was a period in Jewish history which lasted at least 50 years when the Jews in Egypt were praying by shul. The way they daven looked very similar to the way their neighbors who were Muslim were praying. This is an interesting, often overlooked part of history. And I suppose the Rambam, probably if he were alive, might have endorsed it. I'm not sure. Anyway, let's move on to the last part of the medieval history, and that is a very famous story. On Mondays and Thursdays, there's a much longer Tachanun. Begins with V'hurachu mechaper avon. It's in the Ashkenaz Sidurim, it's in the Sephardi Sidurim, and it has roughly 7 or 8 sections to it. Now, Mondays and Thursdays were always considered a more auspicious day for supplications, for ta'aniyot, right? It's very famous that in ancient times, Jewish people used to fast on Mondays and Thursdays. These were the days when the courts would meet in the town. These were the days when Moshe Rabbeinu went up and down from Har Sinai. So already in the Siddur of Avram, we find an instruction that on Mondays and Thursdays, these are days where people add a few more piyutim, a few more tachanunim, but they don't provide an exact nusach. The first place we see an exact nusach is in the Machzor Vitri, and this nusach is quite long. This is this 8-paragraph or 7-paragraph. Some would call it preamble, some would call it a ramble, but it's a very long, very repetitive section of tachanunim. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what my lotes. So we don't know who wrote this very long section of Tachanun, which is recited today on Mondays and Thursdays. But we know that it first appears, of course, in Machzor Vitri in 11th century France. In many, let me open up the translation here. In many early sources from Ashkenaz, we find a legend about the origins of this prayer, which involve a shipwreck. And let me read to you let me read to you the version of the Rokeach, and I'm going to read it to you translated by Tzvi Ron, who wrote an English translation of this Maisa. V'hu Racham. This I'm just going to read to you the translation. V'hu Racham that we recite on Monday and Thursday while standing was established by the men of stature who were exiled from Jerusalem at the destruction of the Second Temple. They were exiled by Vespasian. May his memory be ground to dust. The memory of his bones be ground to dust, who ordered 3 boats and filled them with Jews with no captain and sent them adrift in the ocean. A wind was sent to each one to land in a different area. One landed in Lepanto, one in Arles, and one in Bordeaux. Those who landed in Bordeaux were welcomed by the ruler, and he gave them fields and vineyards, and they were there for many days in peace until that ruler died and a new king arose. What the first ruler established for them, the second one destroyed, and he made new decrees. There were 3 brothers, Yosef, Binyamin, along with Shmuel, their cousin, and they were from the people of Yerushalayim. They cried out to Hashem in their distress, and they fasted and wore sackcloth in their bodies, and they established the tefillah v'hu racham among the 3 of them. Yosef composed v'hu racham until Melech Racham v'Chanunata. Binyamin composed from Ana until Ein Kamocha, and Shmuel composed the rest until Hashem Echad. Afterwards, Hashem saved them and redeemed them and killed the evil oppressor through an unnatural and difficult death. They sent and informed everyone of the whole episode in all places where Jews lived, and the prayer they wrote and told them. They also wrote it down and told them, and they took it upon themselves to recite it on Monday and Thursday, and so is the custom in all of Israel. Here's just another version. An episode happened with a Jewish ship that came from the exile of Yerushalayim to a place with a tyrant. He asked them, "What nation are you from?" They replied, "From the Jewish nation." He told them, "If you are from the Jewish nation, I want to test you, just like Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah were tested in a fiery furnace." They said to him, "Give us 30 days. Whoa. He gave them time. They fasted, and every day whoever had a dream would relate it to the rest of them. At the end of the 30 days, there was an old man who was very big Yirei Shamayim, but he was not very wise. But he said, I saw in a dream that a verse was read to me with the word ki written twice and the word lo written 3 times, but I don't know what the verse was. One of the wise men said to him, you know what that verse is? That verse is the pasuk in Yeshaya. Ki ta'avor b'mayim itechani. If you shall pass through waters, I will be with you. U'baneharot lo yishtafucha. If you go through water, you shall not drown. Ki talech b'mo'esh. As you pass through the fire, lo tichave, you shall not be scorched. V'lehavalo tivar bach. And the flame, it shall not burn you. So one of the most beautiful pasukim in Yeshaya. And so the others heard that he had a dream with that pasuk. They're like, that sounds like we're going to go through the fire and not be harmed. So they built the king's command a great fire at the crossroads, and the person who dreamt the dream went through the fire, and the rest of them went through the fire, and the fire split for them, and they were saved, and they composed this tefillah of V'hu Racham, and each one of these 3 people composed a different section of V'hu Racham. Now, there's one more version. I don't know how important it is for now, but it was also 3 great men. One was Shefatia, one was Amitai, and one was Yosfia. These are Italian names, and they were banished by Titus. Very similar story. Now, earlier historians looked at these legends, and they said what should be obvious, and that is that these have no historical value. This doesn't teach us anything about history. These are Jewish folktales. It tells you nothing about actual history, about what happened. But that was an older way of doing history. And frankly, there is a value to reading this legend because it tells us really important things about how they understood Tachanun in medieval times. First of all, I should note there is an exception. Leopold Zunz thinks that this was written by Jews who were oppressed by the Franks and the Goths in the 700s. There was a tiny community of Jews in Europe in the 700s, and Zunz believes that this is like a legend from that period. But this does tell us quite a few things about the Jews of medieval Europe and what they thought about Tachanun, which I believe is really important for our purposes. First of all, it tells us that they believed, because they used the language that they found this in Shuvot HaGeonim, they believed that this was written by people who were, give me a second. They believed that this was written by people who were a few hundred years earlier than them. Right? The Rishonim thought it was very reasonable that this tefillah of V'hu Racham is at least a few hundred years older than us. It was written by these people who came from boats, and we found it in these teshuvot from sages that lived a few hundred years earlier than us. So it seems that to them it was reasonable that this tefillah, at least in the 11th century, was a few hundred years older than them. That's first of all. Second of all, they believed it was reasonable to believe that it was authored by people in France. People in France, in Bordeaux and Arlot. Frankly, Lepanto is in Greece today. But it was authored by people who were from France, but not native to France, because they were brought here on boats for some other reason. Third of all, they were ancient enough. These authors were ancient enough to use archaic language, because this language is not the language you would find from Ashkenaz. This language is the kind of people who would have lived in Eretz Yisrael. And lastly, they thought it was reasonable to believe that it was a composite prayer that was written by three people, meaning that they looked at the tefillah and they're like, of course, I mean, it's repetitive. The styles are different, and there's at least three sections. And in each section, the style is different, and sometimes it repeats itself, and each one has a different focus. So they saw already in the high Middle Ages, they recognized that this tefillah was much older than them, was not written by people native to France, and that it was a composite prayer. So what does that tell us about the history? Well, it doesn't reveal to us the authors of this tefillah. It doesn't tell us who wrote this 8-section long tefillah, of which the Sephardim today have a shorter one and the Ashkenazim have a longer one. It doesn't tell us much of that, but it does tell us what the Rishonim thought about it, and they recognize that A, it was really old, B, it seems to be a composite, and C, it was the language is definitely from people who were not from around here. They were not from around France. Okay, so this is, for the most part, the attitudes and the way that the Tfilas Apayim looked in the Middle Ages. We find, as I said, throughout the Rishonim, we find a trend towards standardization and fixity in Ashkenaz that begins in the 11th century and doesn't stop until like the 14th century. By the 14th century, you find already a standardization where the Ashkenazim seem to start settling on certain parakim to say in Tehillim, certain formulas of text to say, and the Sephardim begin the process much later, but they also have a much smaller set of prayers. There's also distinct nuschaot in the Italian nusach and in the Temani nusach. And the next week, Bezrat Hashem, when we discuss the modern developments, meaning how the nusach developed in modern times in the past 500 years, Bezrat Hashem, we will discuss that bridge and some of that text in a little bit more detail. So I thank everybody for your time, for your patience and endurance. We will continue Bezrat Hashem next week. Pause.